Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this very special event on behalf of the Vaad Harabonim of Queens in general, and in particular, Rabbi Marcus, its president, and Rabbi Chaim Schwartz, its executive vice president, and together with two other amazing organizations, Ohel and Nefesh, we welcome you to this important and, if I dare say, critical event for all parents. I want to begin just with a Torah thought, a story and a Torah thought, and then the program will be on its way. When I was a younger man, I received a phone call from Eretz Yeshiva. I was back from Eretz Yisrael, and Rameir Stern, for those who may know, very hard to get in touch with. And he had called me to tell me I'm making the wrong decision. I'm choosing the wrong yeshiva. And I said, Rosh Yeshiva Mechilas Kvodo, I still think I'm going to choose my initial choice. Would you still be my Mesader Kedushin when I get married? And he laughed and he said, let me tell you what Das Torah is. Das Torah is not prophecy. Das Torah means with information that I have objectively and through the prism of Torah, I can give you a Torah outlook, but it's only with the information that I have. And I wanted to open with this for other Rabbanim and why, as representative of the Vaad Harabonim, it's important for everyone who's not an expert in this field of trauma, in child psychiatry and child psychology, and especially Rabbanim who deal with this, fortunately or unfortunately, that we also have a lot to learn and a lot to gain. We are limited by our own information. So we are so thankful to Nefesh and Ohel for joining with us tonight to present this to all of us. So I'm just going to share a quick idea just to frame this, B'derech HaTorah. In this week's Parsha, as we all know, this past week's Parsha, we had the last three Makos. And the penultimate Mako was, of course, Makas Choshech. And the Medrash tells us, where was this primordial darkness, Choshech, from? It had to come from somewhere. And the first opinion in the Medrash is that it came from the Choshech Shel Gehenim. It came from Gehenim, as we would imagine. That's a good place for darkness. Amar Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says, no, Choshech Shel Ma'ala. It was a heavenly darkness. And the Arizal and his students ask, what do you mean, a heavenly darkness? What type of darkness could possibly exist within the realm of Kedusha, within the realm of the Shekhinah, in the abode of the Rebbeinu Shel Olam? And explain the student of the Arizal so beautifully, so majestically. There are two types of darkness. There's darkness from a lack of light, but then there's a blindness from too much light. When there's so much sunlight, when the flashlight is shown directly into our face, we become blind. And I think over the past 2 weeks, many parents, and unfortunately many children, have been blinded by the light. We cannot hide anymore from this issue and how to deal as parents with this issue. I just beseech HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we say in Eicha, Yerushalayim is crying, V'demasa alechya, her tears fall on her cheek. And I always suggested that Yirmiyahu is not waxing poetic. We know gravity. We know where tears fall. Where Yirmiyahu is telling us when you give up in a crisis, your tears fall to the floor because you put your head down. But Klal Yisrael, when they go through a crisis, they keep their head up high and they learn lessons and they grow and they speak to professionals and they speak to Rabbanim. B'demasa alechya is a lesson in Golus that we may cry, we may have tragedy, we may have difficult circumstances that we have to get through, but our head is held high and we use Torah and the wisdom of the age to move forward. And with that, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu protect us all from Michshol. May this event be a Ribu Kiddush Shamayim to outshine the Chilul Hashem that took place over the past couple of weeks. I just want to mention, and I'm sure our next presenter will mention this as well, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. They will remain private. No one sees them other than the hosts, and we will get to them after the presentation. It is my great honor to introduce not just a member of my shul, but one of the great experts in her field, and one of the, I believe, founders of Nefesh as well, Dr. Karen Feinberg, who will be introducing our guest speaker.
Thank you, Rabbi Taub. Your words are beautiful. Rabbi Taub was the Murder Asher of my shul, the Young Israel of Holliswood, and it was really Rabbi Taub's vision of the importance of this night that we're bringing this very important program to everyone. And Rabbi Taub, we thank you for your efforts in bringing this to fruition. Rabbi Taub is also a columnist, rabbinic editor of Ami magazine, and the Menahel of Telshe Yeshiva in Riverdale. I also want to thank the Vaad Harabonim of Queens for their encouragement and co-sponsorship of this program. It's now my pleasure to introduce a longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Norman Blumenthal. Dr. Blumenthal is a Zachter Family Chair in Trauma and Crisis Counseling at Ohel, and we very much appreciate Ohel's sponsorship and partnership in tonight's program. Dr. Blumenthal is also a founding member of Nefesh International, an organization of Orthodox mental health professionals, which is dedicated to providing education and training on mental health issues. If I shared with you the rest of Dr. Blumenthal's resume, we would have no time left for his presentation. But more important than all of Dr. Blumenthal's titles and credentials is that he has become a leading go-to person in the frum community anytime there is, unfortunately, a tragedy or loss or crisis. He does not know the meaning of the word no and is always willing to give of his time, energy, and expertise with empathy, compassion, and kindness. As a psychologist at Yeshiva HaTorah, when difficult situations arise, I am asked by parents how and what to share with their children. I feel it's important to use this tragic situation as a teachable moment, to have age-appropriate conversations with our children about physical and sexual abuse, even though it is so very hard to do. We must always give our children the message that they can come to us about absolutely anything. And there is no one better to guide us through this than Dr. Blumenthal. Dr. Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Rosh of Rabbi Taub. With that kind of introduction, you can only be disappointed. But I also wanted to acknowledge, first of all, the very close, both professional and personal relationship I have with Doctors Shalom and Karen Feinberg. I want to thank both of them for not mentioning what I was like when they first knew me, when I didn't have gray hair and had a full head of hair. I also want to, again, acknowledge Ohel, our CEO, David Mendel, for making this possible. And at our age, I'm also always grateful to the tech people, and I want to thank Ari, tech person, our Zoom expert, who's helping this happen. I have a shaykhus to all three sponsors of this event. Obviously, Ohel, I work for them. Nefesh, yes, I'm one of the early, I'm not as early as the Feinbergs, but one of the early founding members of Nefesh and the chairman of the first two conferences. And I'm a native of Queens and have my roots in Queens from many, many years ago. And so I do have a connection to Vaad of Queens as well. This is a very complicated issue. My mother, Leha Shalom, who was a Holocaust survivor of 7 concentration camps and had a treasure trove of Yiddish sayings. One of them was that, and out of respect for Yiddish, I won't try to repeat it in the original, but one of them was that when a poor man has a hernia, there's a pimple on it. And what I think that saying captures is when there's multiple challenges and traumas, one after the other, there's not like, I often talk about the math of trauma. It's not 2 + 2 is 4, but 2 + 2 is 8, and 2 + 2 + 2 is 38. And this, unfortunately, these events have multiple layers to them, which makes it all the more destabilizing, all the more difficult to process with our children and with ourselves. And as Rabbi Taub indicated, more and more that we can grow and learn from. So I'm going to talk about what I think are the various issues, and hopefully within the time frame, leaving some time for the Q&A, which is so important. I am going to discuss the sexual abuse component and how we process it with our children. There's the suicide, which also needs to be put into a realistic and scientifically sound context. There is, how do we judge people like Chaim Walder? How do we look at people like this? Do we see them as sick, or do we see them as evil? And how our enhanced understanding of human behavior has sort of changed our moral compass, and how we have to sort of get regrounded with our awareness of how people become who they are. I do also want to discuss the issue of the books, in which there are many sides to those issues about what to do with the books or how to respond or keep the books, throw them out, whatever. And then the last point I want to talk about is one that I think is not getting its due attention. I do want to talk about that, and that's charismatic individuals and the blessing, and sometimes, unfortunately, on rare occasions, the curse, but that one rotten apple that spoils the whole batch when we have these charismatic, talented people, and how we should approach that. So with that in mind, buckle your seatbelts and let's get going. So first of all, let's talk about the sexual abuse piece. And this is a topic that's been spoken about exhaustively. I am venturing to guess that most, if not all, of the schools that are being represented among the audience have had safety programs already. And if they're in safety programs, that parents themselves have begun to instruct their children on the importance of protecting themselves from a sexual predator. Now, we have a very long-standing tradition in our community that these issues, sexual matters, are not things that we banter about. We don't make jokes about it. We don't discuss it with the sort of casualness that other communities may, for very good reason. And again, I'm not the Rav on this panel, but this is, for us, this is a very important part of life. It's very kadosh. It's a sacred part of life, relegated to the relationship between a husband and wife. And the Gemara even says that only the shoitim, only the fools, just sort of talk about it without any kind of discretion. And therefore, it's almost in our kishkas that we don't like to just sort of talk about and certainly I want to talk about that with young children. Unfortunately, the times are such that we don't have that luxury. And I think we have to look at this from two perspectives. First of all, the perspective of teaching our children safety. And we have a language for this. And if you have not participated in the safety program with your school, there's certainly available our movements, organizations, instruction, educators within our framework who are governed by Torah perspective, who have a way to impart to children the manner and fashion in which they can protect themselves. And this is a teachable moment to reinforce these messages. And the messages, again, al regel achas, is that the body belongs to you and that people can't take liberty with your body. And that if someone does, it doesn't matter how proper, even sacred sanctity, or how holy they may look, this is something that has to be stopped and stopped immediately. And we know from experience that encroachments such as these, if they're addressed immediately, do not have necessarily lasting damaging effects. It's the ongoing abuse and the ones that morph into a sick relationship that have the destructive effects, and the effects are very destructive, not irremediable. There is therapy and there's treatment, but lasting impact, and it requires a lot of therapy to heal those who have been recurrent victims. And so therefore, just as we protect our children from walking into the street and being harmed and from eating the wrong things, we have to have these discussions with our children, as hard as it is and how contrary to our own background that may feel. But it also means, and I've said this in other settings as well, I think the first time I ever suggest what I'm about to suggest, I first went on the FBI website to find out about the witness relocation program. But yes, we do have to, it's part and parcel of teaching our children protective measures. We also have to teach them about the Torah perspective on sexuality and marriage. Again, this was something that we used to have the luxury of waiting until they were older. We don't have that, not only because of this safety factor, but also because of the world that we live in and the exposure they have. When the world itself was more modest and restrained, we didn't have to necessarily address this issue so early, but our children, and whether you have internet or don't, whether you have television or not, they cannot walk the street without being bombarded with messages of how the general world looks at sexuality, and it's very much contrary to how we do. And it becomes necessary for us as parents and educators to impart the proper perspective on, we're not ascetics, we're not against sexual pleasure, but how do we look at it, and how do we address it? And it's too late when they're taking chassan and kala classes. It needs to be done in many respects throughout their childhood. As the old saying goes, when you wait for your pitch, when the opportunity comes, and unfortunately this has been an opportunity. Now, it's important also to know sometimes people are worried about, I don't want to bring up these scary things to my child. I don't want my child to see the world as evil. I don't want them to constantly suspect everyone out there. That the world is a good place, and people, for the vast majority of the world population, are law-abiding, considerate people, and that's true. But children have a capacity to get messages about safety, to know about messages about danger, if it's done right, store it in their brain, and not think about it all the time, but mobilize it and conjure it up when necessary. And I'll give you an example that we've had for a very long time, and it applies to other situations as well. I don't remember now the exact dates, but I believe it was about 100 years ago and change that there was a terrible fire in a Chicago parochial school. There were no fire alarms at the time. There weren't the same kind of fire codes that we have today. The structure was a wooden structure. There were exits were blocked, and the carnage was terrible. I mean, unfortunately, today in New York City, there's been a terrible fire with a high number of deaths. But since then, it has become basically institutionalized that schools have fire drills. And even when old guys like me were kids, we had fire drills. Now, we had fire drills and we knew what to do when that alarm went off, but we didn't think all day about school buildings burning down. So we have that ability to be taught this is dangerous, and we have to protect ourselves, but not have to think about it all the time. Now, the way to do it is very much like fire drills. Give over the instruction, do it intermittently, don't overdo it, don't underdo it. And the same thing is true with these messages, that to let a child know that some of the behaviors for which are imputed to Chaim Walder should arouse an alarm and should require immediate reporting to a responsible adult so that it stops. And again, it doesn't matter how rabbinic or holy the person looks. Sometimes I tell people, again, for the audience that were familiar with it, there's a very famous Rashi in Parshas Lech Lecha when Avram and Lot separate. It says that they had to separate, and Rashi states there that why? Because Lot and Avram looked alike, and Lot was letting his goats into other people's fields and stealing their food, and people thought Avram did it. And this is a very good opportunity to let children know that you can look like an Avram Avinu and still be a Ganav, that you can't look at necessarily external appearances. And by the way, the method we're using is the very same brilliant method that was used by the Jerusalem Police Department with the concept of the Chefetz Chashud, the suspicious object. When terrorism began to occur and the Arabs were leaving incendiary devices lying around and causing much harm, it was literally impossible for the police department to check every corner, every apartment lobby, every alleyway. So they empowered the people. They deputized the people, the citizens, to become policemen. So to look for these suspicious items, which has been adopted now by other countries, adopted in our country as well, as see something, say something. So we're in a way deputizing the citizens to be police. We're doing the same thing for our children. We can't possibly hover over them as much as we want to be helicopter parents to make sure they're safe all the time. We can't be with them in sleepaway camp, but we can teach them what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and let them be the police over their safety. And that's in essence what we're doing. And I was asked recently on a forum when I mentioned this, that why are we passing the buck? Are we telling the children we can't do it, so you have to do it? And I don't think that's the message. I think we're empowering children. I think we're telling children, be proud of who you are, be proud of the wonderful body that Hashem gave you. Be proud of the remarkable capacities that Hashem gave you that someday is going to enhance the most important relationship you'll ever have, a relationship that is used as a metaphor for our relationship with God. So it can be communicated in a way of being proud and being empowered. It's a very precious gift, and you're going to protect it. If I gave you a very precious item as an heirloom, you would lock it up and protect it. This is a very precious gift, and you need to protect it. And again, we don't have time to go into every possible way. But again, I would encourage you to coordinate it, to make sure the messages are consistent with that which your school and others have taught them. Take advantage of those teachable moments when you're taking the child for the pre-camp examination and you're allowing the doctor to examine them and say, I'm here with you, this is allowed. There are those opportune moments to reinforce this message so that we can make sure that our children are safe and that this part of their life will be used much in the fashion and manner as taught us by the Torah and our Rabbanim. The next issue I want to address, and again, there's so many, is the issue of suicide. And again, we can't ignore it. I will admit to you that when I went to graduate school, which I think was sometime around the Civil War or something like that, we were taught that suicide, certainly among adolescents and children, is so rare that if one of them threatens suicide, we shouldn't take it seriously. Unfortunately, again, it's still rare, but it is increasingly part, I mean, it is the suicide rates are going up both for adolescents and for children. And again, it's rare, but it's still going up, and it's not something that we disregard anymore. Now, again, and for that matter, it's not something that we make jokes about or that we speak about in a sort of offhanded way. It's an illness, it's an ailment, and just like there are other rare ailments that can be potentially fatal, so can suicide. So therefore, since it's come up, we may have to speak to children. We have to explain to them, this is a disease also. This is an illness. We know that most suicides, and I'm saying most because this situation was a little different, most suicides are a result of a mental illness, and mental illness is a serious illness, just like heart disease and cancer and other types, neurological disorders is a serious illness. It can be treated. And we have made huge strides in terms of treating mental illness. And so it's something we take seriously, and it's an opportunity to explain to your children that if you're in pain and if something is happening to you that's distressing, or even if nothing's happening to you, but you find your mood to be out of sync with the reality of the world around you, there's help. And there's no heroism in keeping it inside and having a stiffer upper lip and holding yourself. These are opportunities, again, for a teachable moment, that these are matters in which you need to bring to our attention, and we can get you to help to manage them. Now, the other thing that's important to know that there is a contagion to suicide. It's known as the Werther effect. And if there is a celebrity who dies of a suicide, or if there is someone in the school community where there's a death of a suicide, it's not going to create suicidal thinking in someone who doesn't have those tendencies. It's not yesh me'ayin, but somebody who may be struggling with suicide ideas, and anyone who is suicidal, they have an internal battle between their wish to die and their wish to live. It can tip the scale. And therefore, if there is a highly publicized suicide, or if there is a suicide in one's immediate community, those people who may be grappling with depression or suicide ideation should be attended to, and should certainly ascertain that they're getting the help that they need. And again, they're scary topics, but cancer is scary, and vehicular accidents are scary, and terrorist attacks are scary, and we have to make our children aware enough so they will take protective measures. And even if we're not talking about suicide, we have to make our children aware that there's no need today to suffer from mental illness, that there is provisions and help, and they just have to share it. There is one point that needs to be made in terms of this situation, the Chaim Walder situation, is that it doesn't look to me that the Chaim Walder suicide was one, as most are, prompted by mental illness. His may have been more an element of trying to avoid being defamed and being a public spectacle of the type that he would have been had the legal process continued. So this may have been very different than probably the suicides that we've had to deal with. And the more savvy child might pick up on that. I'm not sure if that has to be introduced to every child, but if that becomes the topic of conversation, or if a child brings it up. And again, we don't talk about it too much. And it's unfortunate. There used to be an understanding in the media that when a celebrity took their life, and by the way, you might notice I'm avoiding using the word commit suicide. And the reason for that is that harks back to when suicide was considered a crime. And so you commit a crime. As I said, the majority of suicides today are as a result of an illness. So we talk more in terms of dying from a suicide, but that this one may have been different, the vast majority. So a more savvy kid may pick up on that, and then that's a conversation. But again, it's a reality, and we have to address it and talk about it. And by the way, many children may be aware of some of the halachas in terms of suicide, in terms of the suicide victim not being eulogized, not sitting shiva, not being buried in a cemetery. And my understanding, and I have discussed this with much greater minds than mine, and certainly in Torah knowledge, is that those are situations where taking one's life is done more rationally, where it's a shita, where it's an outlook, perhaps like Socrates drinking the hemlock, not the kind of suicide that comes from people who are suffering from mental illness. And so it's a different kettle of fish. Next topic I want to talk about is how do we explain to our children who this person, this Chaim Walder is, or anyone like him that may have been engaged in such highly irreputable behaviors. I remember this, by the way, first came up after the Levi Kletsky murder. But how do we explain to our children who this Levi Aaron is? Do we tell our children this person is sick, or do we tell our children this person's a Russia? This person's a bad person. And I want to address that for a few moments. It's interesting, if you look at it historically, that the study of human behavior, why we become who we are, is a fairly recent development. I mean, Freud wrote his first book at the end of the 19th century. But even before Freud wrote his book, there was starting to grow an interest in trying to understand people in terms of behavior, how they evolve and become as who they are. In fact, I know that there's some scholars who actually see a connection between this happening in the general world and the evolution of the Muslim movement in our world, because suddenly, how do you become who you are? Or how do you learn how to become somebody different? And certainly this has enhanced our lives immensely and has resulted in our greater understanding of human behavior and our having developed the therapeutic techniques that's so associated with Nefesh and with Ohel. But what has happened, though, is that we've had to sort of redefine our moral compass. Because if we can understand and explain away behaviors, and for that matter, as we become increasingly aware of genetic predispositions that determine how people become, not only what people's eye colors are and what their height is, but how their behaviors and temperament is governed by genetics, then how do we hold people culpable anymore? They're just a product of their environment. They're just a product of their DNA. And are we losing this concept of a Russia? Sometimes I say a bit tongue in cheek, and I know it's a bit of a hyperbole, but maybe Osama bin Laden was bullied as a child, and maybe Charles Manson came from a broken home. And are we going to now lose our moral compass? And then, of course, this comes up now, and it came up with Levi Aaron. It's coming up again now with Chaim Walder. Is Chaim Walder a sick man? And then maybe he shouldn't be held responsible for what he did. Or is he an evil man? And now we're losing, we in Judaism, the basic concept that there are Rishayim, a handful of Rishayim, a handful of Tzaddikim, and all of us somehow Beinonim, somewhere in between, is that as clear to us now that when we have this understanding of human behavior and how people become who they are. And I think the answer to that question, which I think is endorsed both by the members of the Orthodox Jewish mental health community, again represented by Nefesh, and and thank God it's a significant number, and some of the highly placed people within the field of mental health, is that yes, to some extent we are who we are because of circumstances in our lives or because of our genetics. But if we have a particular predisposition, you have two obligations. First, you have to understand yourself. You have to know yourself. And there has to be self-examination. And if you have a predilection towards in the direction of behavior that you could engage in either behavior that's harmful to yourself or even worse, harmful to other people, then you have to be doubly careful. You have to take extra special precautions for these predilections. If you have a family history of alcoholism, you may not have the luxury of having as many l'chaims. You may have to exercise more restraint in terms of avoiding alcohol. So it's not an excuse, it's just an alarm to be more careful. I'll give you as a personal example. I mean, it's not very divulging, but When, I work with kids, and sometimes if there's a Netflix movie they're very interested, they're very into, or if there's a song on the radio they're into, or if there's a video game that they're into, I like to just get an idea about it. So I might download a trailer. I might take a sample of the game, just look at it so I get a sense about it. When Fortnite hit the scene, and as you know, it's an incredibly addictive game. And I was hearing more and more, not only about children, but adults, who are having a very hard time controlling their interest and involvement in Fortnite. I thought, you know what, I should probably download a sample, try it out, or go to somebody else's house and see what that game is about. And I kept delaying and postponing. And finally, I realized I understood myself. If a game like that, I could get hooked. I know myself. I could get over involved in that game, so I had to refrain from even trying it. And that's, I think, the model. Now, in terms of our children, how do we explain this? I think we have to differentiate between teens and preteens. The preteen sees the world in more absolute terms. There's good guys, bad guys, there's cowboys, Indians, I don't know, whatever, however you want to, I guess that's outdated now. But they see the world in a more polarized, simplistic way. And to introduce the concept that a person could be sick and then at the same time have culpability, I think is too complex. I think for the preteen children, this man was evil, this man was a Russia, and it's the kind of person we try to avoid. I think when it comes to teenagers who can understand the nuanced understanding of people, that they can understand that things that seem like contradictions can coexist in one's brain, we can introduce this concept, and it might be useful as well because teens are at that age where they're developing an identity, where they're starting to look at themselves, where they're trying to understand themselves and understand that all of us are very complex. Sometimes what I use is one of my favorite parts of my interpretation of Haggadah when we get to the four sons. And there's the famous story by the Kotzker Rebbe of the king who sent his son around the world. And when he came back, the king asked his son, what did you see? And he said, well, I saw this very wise man, this brilliant man. He said, what else did you see? I saw this real simple man, very simplistic, not too smart. What else did you say? I saw this very refined man, this very moral person. He said, what else did you say? I saw this wicked, evil person. So the king said, for that, I have to send you around the world. We have people like that in our kingdom. And the son said to him, you don't understand, he was one person. And the Kotzker Rebbe is telling us the four sons are four sides of ourselves. That's a sophisticated concept. That's a good time in adolescence to introduce that there is such a thing as an illness, there is such a thing as genetic predispositions, but that doesn't absolve you from responsibility. Again, that could be one of the teachable moments from this debacle that we're dealing with now. The other issue that I wanted to bring up is the issue that many people have dealt with was the issue about the books. Do we throw out the books? Do we keep the books? And I want to address both sides, and you'll see where my bias lies. The comment in favor of keeping the books, is that many people find the content very helpful, very educational, and why should our children be deprived of the positive messages that may be in the books because of the reprehensible actions of its author? And the other factor, which is there is a dearth of good reading for our children, and especially those who may want to insulate their children more or less from some of the general literature, and some of which has messages and promotes behaviors that are contrary to our community. And therefore, why now get rid of some of the few good books that we do have in that area? So the other side of that is, and I'm going to present three counter arguments. One is, yes, it matters that whoever wrote this book, and if somebody whose behavior was so contrary to our values wrote the books, then they don't deserve to be in our bookshelves. So that would be one argument for removing it. The other one, which I think is probably the most compelling argument as far as I'm concerned, and maybe it's the bias of being a therapist, but knowing what sexual abuse it has done to individuals, knowing the pain, suffering, and the what the sexual abuse survivor has to endure, anything that would trigger that man or woman should not be present. And I remember when I was an intern. This goes back many years, probably most of you don't remember this, but the American Nazi Party was planning a march through Skokie, the suburb of Chicago, where at that time, many Holocaust survivors lived. And the ACLU and others felt, well, it's freedom of speech. It's, even though most of us find the actions, and obviously what the Nazis did is just unthinkable and horrible, but they have a right to freedom of speech. And I remember I wrote a letter to the editor, I think it was the New York Times, and of course it didn't get published, but my feeling was you have no right to go to someone and cut them and punch them and hurt them. You also have no right to go to somebody and trigger their trauma. That's also harmful, and that's not freedom of speech. And I think the same thing is true here, that we need to do whatever we can to help the survivors of sexual abuse who are among the most injured in our community. And if seeing a book like that on the shelf is going to bring back those memories or is going to salt their wounds, we have an obligation to do with less reading. There's another piece to this that I'm not sure has gotten its fair share of attention, but I think we need to address as well. I'm reminded of a friend of mine when I was growing up who was really an aficionado of classical music. He loved classical music. He listened only to classical music. And he told me that he would listen to a piece, he'd listen to a symphony, and not only did he know the symphony, but he knew who the conductor was. He could listen to two different versions of Beethoven's Fifth, and from listening to it, he could tell which conductor was leading the orchestra. It's, I think, literally impossible, especially people engaged in creative endeavors, that we don't put part of ourselves into what we do. I can certainly say for myself as a therapist, part of my personality is infused, because obviously what I'm doing is what I'm learning in techniques and I understand from research, but part of it is infused with who I am and my emphases. I think it is literally impossible that someone who had such corrupt and destructive tendencies couldn't have allowed that to creep into the book. And I think we have to remind ourselves as well that the inadvertent message is sometimes far more destructive than the direct message. Just to give a sort of silly example, if I want to sell you Pepsi Cola, I could get someone who looks professorial and like me and get up there and say, hey, you really should buy Pepsi Cola. It has more bubbles, it has more sugar. Or I could have a scene on a beach where gorgeous people are having the time of their lives and everybody's smiling and laughing, don't have a worry in the world. Derech Hagav happens to be they're drinking Pepsi Cola. The inadvertent message is far more powerful. And I think we have to consider that that messages may be implicit in the books. And I will tell you that I've heard now already from several, obviously we all have 20/20 hindsight. So now since this has been all divulged, we're all looking at the books and finding many, and people have showed them to me, many messages and comments that are questionable and maybe, maybe deceptively, luring children in the wrong direction. But I know a few people, not many, including one sexual abuse survivor who said that he looked at the books, or she looked at the books before this all came out, and there was just something about them that bothered him. Something, one person described them as dark. So I think we have to be concerned that without being fully aware, there may have been messages, implicit messages that were conveyed in that book. If someone who is so corrupt, and that the books aren't as valuable as we may think they are. One more point I want to make, and then sort of jump to a conclusion. I'm sorry, something just happened. Okay, jump to a conclusion, which is, and this again, I'm not sure is getting enough attention. It's a very difficult subject, as I'll explain, which is what I refer to as the Pied Pipers of our community. We have a very big struggle as Orthodox Jews. We're trying to steer our children in the direction of Torah in a disciplined life, a life where we're forgoing some of the surface pleasures that are so readily available in our surroundings. And we're competing against a lot of razzle dazzle in today's age of technology. We're competing against Netflix. We're competing against movies and shows, etc. And this isn't easy. And what has evolved is a cadre of very talented, charismatic individuals who are inspiring our children, hopefully all are inspiring our children to be part of the Torah observant community. I'm talking about the charismatic, young, fascinating Rabbi in the yeshivot we send our children to, or in the seminaries. I'm talking about the division heads in camps. I'm talking about the guest speakers, the itinerant speakers who come to our yeshivas on special days and give these incredibly inspiring speeches. And we have a whole bunch of them, and it's been an enhancement of our community. Maybe the reason why we have as much adherence from one generation to another to a lifestyle that's so contrary to the world around us and requiring restraint and a disavowal of some of the pleasures that the society has to offer. However, some of them have used, and unfortunately Chaim Walder is not the first one, if we think historically, have used their charismatic nature and their magical ability to engage children, adults, inspire them for nefarious purposes. And I think this raises a few questions, and this may raise more questions than answers, which is, do we have to be a little wary and cautious about people who are the Pied Pipers, who have such an ability to inspire others, or for that matter, for ourselves? How do we look at our own talents? And we all have talents, and how do we understand them and channel them? Our ability, especially if the talents are such to engage and inspire other people. We may have to, again, one of the lessons from this, we have to look at it and realize this is a gift from God and has to be used for divine purposes. And we have to sort of not only look at others, but look at ourselves. And we all have talents, and how we look at our talents and where we challenge them. We have a tradition to end on a positive note. So I want to just close this very difficult topic on a positive note. Thank God, as Rabbi Taub mentioned, we're struggling, and that's what we do. We're not just brushing this under the carpet. From many different segments, from Rosh Yeshiva, from educators, from mental health professionals, we're grappling with what happened, and we're trying to use it to not only prevent future harm, but to enhance ourselves as individuals, families, and communities. Thank God we have the ways to heal for those who may have been harmed. Thank God we have Harabonim of Queens, we have an Ohel, we have a Nefesh, and there are ways for people who have been harmed to be healed, and to be healed even at for those who cannot afford it, at rates that they can afford through low cost services in clinics. So we have the resources available for our community, and with the help of Hashem, this should be not just a tragedy, but an opportunity to enter a new chapter in our history, and one that will be characterized by more safety, growth, and understanding of our place in the community, and our ability to exercise restraint and live a rich, fulfilling life. So at this point, I will turn the party back to Rabbi Taub, and we can do some of the Q&A.
Yeah, Shakayach, Dr. Blumenthal, that was enlightening, critical, important. Dr. Karen Feinberg is also going to join me now in sifting through many of the questions. I just want to mention one thing. I'm going to use the bully pulpit just for a moment. The halacha question of getting rid of his books. From a halachic perspective, obviously there's a professional perspective. As parents, I was speaking to someone, because I personally am not anybody's Rav, feel that we should get rid of them. And a very chashva Talmid Chacham said to me the arguments that Dr. Blumenthal, you mentioned on the other side. And I said, you'll tell me if this is right, mimanav shach. No matter what the case is, your child now is going to repeat a story in a month, in a year, in 2 years. You keep him in the dark, he's going to find out about sexual events by recess. Someone's going to inform him. Whatever your view is of the books, we have to have control. But I just want to point out, and again, I'm using the bully pulpit, on a YouTube video that I put up on the Shaila. You don't have to watch the YouTube video, it's an hour long, but I have Mar Makomos, because the job of a Rav, as opposed to a psychiatrist, a psychologist, is not to give his personal view. He's from the judicial branch, not the legislative branch. And you could print out those Mar Makomos from the Gemara through the Ben Ish Chai and the Chazon Ish, and bring it to your Meir Hara, bring it to your Rav, and discuss it with him. The most common question, Dr. Blumenthal, that came up It's a fascinating question and an important one. I doubt this will be the next Art Scroll book, but is there a resource that frum families can use to discuss sexual matters with their children? And I don't think they just meant the birds and the bees. I mean, these types of issues.
So I believe there are some attempts. There have been some Sfarim, I don't remember offhand, but some Sfarim even that have been endorsed within more yeshiva settings, and then in some of the more modern settings, there's been attempts by YU to put out some books. I think we're still struggling with it. If I will share with my bias, and I guess I'm a big talker because the old line about the definition of a Zionist is Reuven telling Shimon to make Aliyah with Levi's money. It's I'm very easy telling what everybody else should do. I think there needs to be a curriculum from kindergarten through high school related. Of course, in kindergarten you're not going to talk about sexual matters, but we can talk about pleasure. And where do we place pleasure? When second graders are learning Parshas Noach and that Noach planted a vineyard first, and that was what caused the whole debacle with Chum, we can tell children we're not against vineyards, we're not against wine. It's not the first thing you do. There are ways to inculcate these messages that I think needs to be done throughout one's education. I believe, again, I'm not familiar. I know there's also for the women. There's some very better books than for the men. And I don't have my fingertips the names, and maybe some people on the online do, and they can submit them. So there have been some very valiant efforts and some excellent attempts. I wished maybe I should have prepared better and had some of the sources at my fingertips, but I don't.
So
I'm sorry, maybe what you're thinking of, Dr. Blumenthal, is by Yocheved Debo, is Life Values and Intimacy Education is one, and Sarah Diamond wrote Talking to Your Children About Intimacy. So there's two that people can look at.
Okay, great. Which is more for girls, if I'm not mistaken, than boys. Right. I think there's much more.
There's sections on boys also.
Boys too. Also, okay, great. Good to hear.
Perhaps
please.
When this is uploaded on the various websites, Ohel Nefesh Vaad Harabonim will place the name of the author and the book and where to purchase it online. Relating to what you said, another question that came up a few times, and by the way, for those that requested, all questions are going to be anonymous. So a few of the people said, please don't mention our name. We would never do such a thing. And you alluded to this a little bit, and that's about age. And I want to mention age because one of the questions that I received, and I know other Rabbanim had received, is you have an 8-year-old reading this book. As I said, go to Eichler's, go get another book. When he finishes it, switch it. But is there an age to talk to them about touching, to talk to them about what makes you feel uncomfortable? What would be the age?
So the safety programs, for which there are many, start with even kindergarten, preschool. Again, they're potential victims as well. There's even, again, I'm sorry to mention, even such a thing as sexual attraction to infants. Of course, obviously, the infant can't protect themselves, but there is such a thing. So we have to address it from very early age, but the manner and fashion in which it's addressed in preschool is through puppets and more metaphorically. So you don't address it as much in terms of themselves, because that's the way the preschool child processes the world, but through, as I said, puppets, talking, stories about animals, and a lot of it also depends on teaching our children to trust their instinctive response. If this feels uchi, if this feels wrong, trust that feeling. And that can be said even to younger children. For example, I'll just give you an example. We have very large families, and sometimes we rely on older siblings to take some of the parental responsibilities. I tell parents all the time, you're going for that pre-camp examination with the doctor, you don't send the older sister. You don't send your child along with the neighbor. You go there yourself, and you stand there and you say to the child, I'm allowing this because he's our doctor and I'm here. There are many messages you can give all along. I'll give you another just example, and I hope I'm not going on a tangent, but I was once doing a safety program, and someone said to me, I'm the candy man in shul. And, we tell our kids not to go to a stranger and take candy. Should I stop doing it? Now, the candy man's an institution. And that's to teach the children that shul is sweet and fun to be there. So I suggested to him one of two: just leave the bag nearby and let them take themselves, not near you. Or every time they come, you say, did daddy say it's okay? Or you look at the father, is it okay? And let them know that you don't just take candy from someone unless the parent, okay. So there are different ways to teach it, to teach these safety precautions without even instruction, just the manner and fashion in which we interact with our children. Again, if somebody wants more specific guidance, there's the Magain program. I think there are many programs that are more similar than dissimilar, where somebody can get a sort of template for how to explain these matters to their children.
Dr. Feinberg, there are some requests. If you could name slowly, maybe spell the books again that you had mentioned.
Okay. One is by Dr. Yocheved Debow, Debow. It's called Life, Values, and Intimacy Education. And one is by Sarah Diamond, Diamant, and it's called Talking to Your Children About Intimacy.
So thank you. There's a question that has come up a few times in the Q&A, and I'm somewhat loath to mention it, but it's the $64,000 question. It's the elephant in the room, and we have other questions, but I do want to tackle it. And
64,000 is not going to do it today. There's inflation.
Right. I don't know what that game show would be called today.
Right.
The $64 million mortgage. And especially those in Nefesh and Ohel who work with Gedolei HaPoskim, who can help me deal with this, because I know my opinion, Ani HaKatan, based on Rabbi Yashev and others. That's the issue of Mesira. And this is not the topic tonight, and I want to be very clear. Everybody listening has a Meira Haira. I believe, at least in the Litvische world, Rabbi Yashev's letter to Raphael Cohen made this very clear, as well as others. Obviously, if we have information, real information, we don't have to stop at go. We could go directly to the police. It's only when we have a sneaking suspicion or we heard something through the grapevine, we don't have direct evidence, that's when perhaps speaking to an objective professional or a Rav is important. Is that a correct framing?
So my understanding, and I guess here, we at Ohel rely on this Pesach of Reb David Cohen. He's our Mora Halacha, and my understanding, and again, I'm in no position to comment. I'm just being the letter carrier. Is that in that case, in his instance, I think the Pesach we got was with regard to reporting to ACS that first of all, it is a pekuach nefesh, and we do know that there are high suicide rates among or self-destructive behavior among survivors of sexual abuse, but also that, and this may not apply to reporting the behaviors like Samachai and Walder, but when a parental figure is reported for abuse or neglect, then they don't right away throw the person in jail, and they don't right away take the children away. Usually what they do is mandate treatment, and that's what they really need. So I think on that basis that we've gotten the head, if my understanding is correct, to terms of Mesira. In terms of Mesira to the police, I'm out of my league, but I think the understanding is, and I think that's where we have we've been remiss, is I don't know if we understand. If we were aware of an adult who was poisoning a child, I don't think we'd have, giving him actual poisonous food that would potentially harm or make the child die, we'd have any question about whether we should go to law enforcement. This is poison, and this is incredibly destructive. And therefore, I think that's my understanding, where I think the growing consensus is that we hand this over to law enforcement.
For those listening, I do have the Vaad Harabonim sign behind me, but I'm speaking now just for myself. But everybody should speak to the Rav. If there's any Rabbanim online, I want to urge my Chaverim to give a shir in their shul on this topic. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman used to say, and he Nebuch died at the hand of the Nazis, we shouldn't wait to dial Kiddush Hashem to teach these halachos when it's too late. All the more so over here. People shouldn't have confusion beforehand. And for those who are curious, Rabbi Yashev wrote to Raphael Cohen that when halacha, due to the fact that we're in Gullus, does not have the tools to deal with the scourge of society, we have no choice but to go to the authorities, even if that means they will be punished beyond the breadth of understanding of halacha. But again, speak to your Rabbanim before you get into these matters. a question that came up a few times, and I'm questioning how to phrase it, and it's a fascinating question based, Dr. Blumenthal, in your presentation. You mentioned one of my favorite terms, razzle dazzle. I always love that expression. And there is this dichotomy here that we're dealing with. We are trying to compete with Netflix, and we are trying to compete with I was about to say Musically, but I know there's something more, and I should know it, and I do know it. What's the word I'm looking for? The new one.
Spotify.
No. All the parents are screaming into their computer now, saying what it is. It's short vid TikTok. That's it.
TikTok, sure.
Right?
Okay.
Which, by the way, is destroying, as a teacher, it's destroying the focus of children. That's a whole different discussion. And it is hard. And you do want people with razzle dazzle. You do want people who could capture an audience. And one of the questioners said, first of all, how do you make a distinction between the dangerous ones? And another parent asked, I think, a mirror question to that. We go to our children and we explain to them that he was evil or that he was sick. Either way, and both of those views was a fascinating discussion, Dr. Blumenthal. Aren't we creating distrust for the next person who comes along? So really, it's one question: how do we, as parents, desire great speakers and talented teachers and people who really aliven our kids and galvanize them to grow, and at the same time not turn us into cynics? There's an old line: "There's no such thing as a cynic, only a failed optimist." And I think the Walder event turned us all into failed optimists. So how do we balance this?
You referenced your Rebbeim, so I'll reference my Rebbe. I had the very special zchus to be in Rav Aaron Kreiser's shir for 3 years in YU. And Rav Aaron used to tell us that if there was a line in the Gemara he didn't have a kasha on, he didn't understand it. And that was shir. We'd have a shir, questions after questions after questions. And in fact, he used to tell us that most of your Rebbeim will mess up your heads and straighten out the Gemara. I'm going to mess up the Gemara and straighten out your heads. So it's a question, and I sort of not sure myself. And it's unfortunate also, but I think I alluded to this, that sometimes it's the one rotten apple that destroys the whole batch. I mean, it used to be a time that there was nothing out of the ordinary for a pre-1A Rebbe to put the kid in their lap and to kiss the child and to give him candy. Today, most pre-1A Rebbes can't do this because the one out of 500 who had ulterior motives when he did this. So there is a price we pay for those few rotten apples. Do we do away with these charismatic individuals? Do we look at them as scants? Do we, I'm not sure myself. I do think, and that's what I was trying to allude to, my best answer, and I haven't landed with this one either. So I'm if any people have suggestions or ideas, I'm open to it. But I think what we can cull from this, the lesson we can cull is, what do we do with our talents? We all have talents, so some people have more talents than others. And and to be a little, like they talk about the nisayon of wealth, not one that I know, but, there's a nisayon of skill and talent. And if you are one of these charismatic, talented people, you have to be a little bit afraid of yourself. There has to be an element of fear because you can get carried away. I remember, I'm involved in teaching the Smicha program at YU. And when I remember his name, Freundlich, I think his name was, that rabbi in Washington, D.C., who did that horrible thing with the cameras and the mikvahs, the Smicha guys were a wreck. And many of them said, what if I become one of these celebrity rabbis? What if I become one of these who everybody adores and looks up to? Would I do something as awful as that? And one of the answers we told them is, thank God you're afraid. But we have to maybe be a little wary and cautious, especially if we are one of those charismatic people, if we are magic with children, and make sure that we channel those skills in the right direction. I think that has to be part of our thinking. But what we do about the ones who exist already, and I'm sure the vast majority of which are totally l'shem shemayim, I struggle with this myself.
Oh, I from a personal perspective, and for those listening, I'm going to be a little bit personal. Among my many jobs, I teach in a Beis Yaakov high school, 12th grade. And, me and my wife always discuss that in a perfect world, not because of from reasons, I was mentioning the other week to my shul that when Moshe Feinstein wrote his tshuva about singing Karbach music, people thought that was crazy until the Me Too movement. And then they said, oh, he was ahead of his time in a perfect world. But I told the girls, and it took me a few years to realize, I have 4 daughters, so I would make nothing untoward, but to create a certain distance. I started to learn how to do that. And this really leads to my second question, both as a teacher and for parents listening, and for students listening for that matter. And I wonder if you agree, because the next question is, what are the warning signs? You have a charismatic person. Your daughter comes home, they had a speaker in school who said, here's my email address. Is that a warning sign to the school if you have questions? Beis Yaakovs do bring in wonderful people who speak about society and girlfriends and boyfriends and television and so on. And there are those who have been known to give contact information. I told the girls as an example, if ever you get a lift home from a teacher, if he says, come sit in the front, that's a warning sign. My wife said, no, they shouldn't even give you a lift home. And someone else said, no, let them sit in the front seat. So what are the warning signs, both for us as mechanchim, that we, like you said, be afraid of yourself, but more importantly, as a student and as a teacher and as a principal, what are warning signs that we should be looking for in the razzle-dazzle creative people that we should have a talk or be concerned?
So perfection, we don't have, today we're used to blood tests and MRIs and get definitive answers. I'm not sure if we have that very clear line, but I think you alluded to a lot. If we're going to err, let's err in the direction of being too careful. I think, and that's like I was saying with the Candyman. I'm sure the Candyman has no, ulterior motives. But we have to teach our children to have what I said before was that uchi feeling, that when someone offers to drive them home and says sit in the front, it doesn't feel well, and to trust that instinct. Now, some people are more intuitive than others. And if we're educating our children, if you have a kid who is naturally intuitive, you can trust the feeling. If you have a kid, let's say a bit of an egghead, who's all rational and might be oblivious, we'd have to be maybe more strenuous in our instruction. But I would say I can't, right now, give you a list of 20 things that I think are overstepping boundaries. But I think we have to be more careful, and I think we have to err in the direction. And I say this with a heavy heart, because I know, just like I said with the Pre-1A Rebbe, that we may, in some respects, stifle some of these 100% well-intended, inspiring people. But we live in the world that we live in, and we therefore have to, I would say, without being insane about it, I think we have to err in the direction of being more cautious, but more importantly, we have to weave into our understanding of the world that there's certain sensibilities. The sensibilities are that adults don't play with children. The sensibilities are that a faculty member uses only the faculty bathroom in school and doesn't use the general bathroom. The sensibilities have to be that when you're a camp counselor, and you have to put and child need to have suntan lotion put on, send a spray. Don't send creams. These are all, each one sounds like we're being petty, but if it becomes, I think, a general way in which we operate, and again, we're not against, and at the same time, we're not against fun. We're not against pleasure. We're not against friendship. We're not against inspiring. A very important part, for example, of adolescence is to have alternative adult figures who inspire the children, because they're individuating. So they're not just going to look up at their parents, they're going to look up to their Rebbeim and to their teachers. So without throwing out the kettle with the water, but I think we have to err in the direction of being very careful, especially when it comes to private time together, issues that involve touch, things that can be misunderstood.
Is there a way, Dr. Blumenthal, on that same note, because we covered the books and we covered what other type of books there are for parents and Nasira and what are warning signs. There was I think he's still the president of the Reform Jewish Society of America. The reason why he went into I don't want to call it Clay Kodesh, into the Jewish world, he said over a story that when he was a young boy, he was raised in a small town. The rabbi was Rabbi Nachman Bullman, who we all know from Or Sameach. And he was doing a Shabbos class at his house for young kids in the community. And they were learning Mishnayos. And he asked the question, this young boy, and Rabbi Bullman got up and he kissed the boy on his forehead. And he said, I never forgot that kiss. And that always kept me close to Yiddishkeit. And, it's a chaval. And one of the great abuses that these abusers do, they don't just destroy their victims, they change the trajectory of the ship of Torah and Klal Yisrael. And I just wonder from a professional, and of course, Dr. Feinberg, also for the mothers and so for everybody to respond, is there a way, because as a Rav, I have the kids in my home, not since COVID, but God willing soon, Shabbos afternoons, and I would love to show affection. I haven't in 15 years. I don't know what I can do, what I can't do. And I feel a little bit paralyzed, and maybe that's a good thing. Better safe than sorry. But what type of, if it's in a public venue, is it okay? And what type of affection would be okay?
So, I don't believe in hand wringing, and I don't believe in doing the good old days. I like to quote the great philosopher and theologian. You quoted, I'll quote a great philosopher and theologian, Wayne Gretzky, who says that I skate to where the puck.
I'm Canadian, so.
Okay. He says I skate to where the puck is going, not to where it's been. We have to live in our times, and every generation has benefits, disadvantages, and we have to live. So yes, it behooves us to find. Let's go back to that pre-1A Rebbe. That pre-1A Rebbe, or let's say that Rabbi Bowman story. We have to learn how to kiss in different ways. Maybe we have to learn how to kiss with words. Maybe we have to learn how to kiss with facial expressions. We can't just throw up our hands and say, oh, we can't be inspiring and loving to our children. But in times such as this, we have to be more creative in the way in which we do it. So I would say to the next Rabbi Bowman, or to the pre-1 Rebbe today, or to the candy man, or to the camp counselor, inspire our children, love our children, make sure our children have you internalized and remembered throughout their lives. But you'll have to do it differently because of the times we live in. And we have no shortage of creativity and imagination in our community, and we'll figure it out.
In many schools, we have in my school, we have a whole list of what teachers can and can't do, because just to protect the children and to protect the teacher, that God forbid anybody say you did this. So we have tutoring rooms after school where the teachers can tutor, can't tutor anywhere in the building. We have to be able to come in and come out. We have windows on all the doors that you're not allowed to cover up. You're not allowed to text a student. You're not allowed to take a student in your car unless you have specific permission from the parent to do that. And then the parent knows that you're on your way. I think we have to set the boundaries, and it protects the children and it protects the adults. So I agree with what Dr. Blumenthal was saying. I just wanted to correct the rabbi, and a few people asked that we correct the rabbi in DC was Barry Freundel.
Freundel, I couldn't remember.
Name, not the incorrect name.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I know it's getting late, and I want to mention just two quick things. Just first of all, about myself. If there's a Rabbanim online, I advise this. I remember I used to be a rabbi in Buffalo, and Richard Berger, my president, came over to me and said, "Rabbi, I need you to sign a document." And I looked at the document, and it was like, looked like a Bible. I said, "What is this?" He said, "It's the shul's insurance." I said, "What?" Well, he said, "We have to insure you for sexual abuse," and it was a frightening concept. I don't know if every shul does that. From that moment on, I decided. And by the way, that was something they've done before me. They've done after me. It's a very smart idea. From that moment on, I decided I'm going to keep the laws of Yichud for both men and women, boys and girls. I think it's important for Rabbanim to meet, if they meet with children, to do so with the parent there. If the parent doesn't want to come in, then the parent should be outside. If even an adult, a male, meets with me, I'll let the president know I'm in shul in such and such a time. My office is open. It's very important. We really got to all the questions. I know if you feel your question wasn't asked, it was incorporated. There was one question that was very cynical that came up, understandably so, a little bit, which is, are Rabbanim taking this seriously enough? And I'll leave this to Dr. Blumenthal. I just want to say, let this event be evidence that we do. When I called Rabbi Marcus and the Vaad about this event, Rabbi Schwartz, they were so excited to the wrong word, because it's an unfortunate situation that we're in, but anticipatory towards this event and knowing how much it's needed. Every colleague I have knows how important it is and takes it very seriously and understands the Peter principle, understands the limits of Rabbanim's information. So I want to conclude my last words before Dr. Blumenthal closes us out by thanking you, thanking Ohel, thanking Nefesh, thanking the Feinbergs, without whom this event couldn't have taken place. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu just bless you with continued siyata d'shmaya and make a riba kiddush shamayim. But could you talk directly to the Rabbanim listening and to the Balabatim listening of what has been and what should be the appropriate response from Rabbanim?
So, just as with psychologists, there's good Rabbanim, they're very good Rabbanim, they're excellent Rabbanim. What I want to say, and I hope this will be taken the right way. It's wonderful to be ensconced in Torah, and we part of our oxygen are those people who are learning 24/7. But if you're going to take a leadership role in the community, if you're going to be a pulpit rabbi or one of those kind of Rosh Yeshivas who involve themselves in, beyond the kosel of the kosel Beis HaMedrash, you need to be aware. You need to be aware of what's happening. You need to, unfortunately, know what's going on in society. You also need to know how to say, how to delicately express the very important messages you have. Some of the messages that have been out there in the world, and today everything just spreads like wildfire. And many of the things that have where Rabbanim or for the others, but as well, have been criticized. If you look at what they're saying, they're not saying anything so terrible, but they didn't have the sophistication in terms of expression, how to give over those ideas. And I think maybe one lesson we have to learn from this, for those who choose to be in those positions. I remember once someone who has a hashgacha told me that the mashgiach has to be a bigger ganav than the ganav. You have to think like the guy who has a restaurant, a kitchen, and is hiding tarfus. Because otherwise, and then he finds it. We have to, unfortunately, sully your hands, know what's going on in the world, know how to discuss, especially when we're talking about sexual abuse, how to say it in a fashion and in a manner where your important messages are understood correctly, and not understood correctly just in a Torah journal, but understood correctly in a text and something that's printed online. These communication skills and these awareness we need it. I'll conclude with a story that's a legacy in my family, and maybe that's a good way to sort of give this message over. My grandfather, who I'm named after, who was murdered in Auschwitz, Hashem Yikom Damo, was originally deported to Theresienstadt. And in Theresienstadt, you were allowed to take with you whatever you could carry in your hands. So he took Sfarim, and he was in a bunk full of secular Jews, nobody other religious, and he would sit on his bunk bed and learn. And there was a cleaning rotation in the bunk. And whenever it was his turn, the rest of the guys in that bunk, they would, while he was learning, they'd be playing cards, smoking, just schmoozing. Whenever it was his turn to clean the bunk, he would grab a mop and start mopping, and invariably one of the other guys would come over, yank the mop out of his hand and start cleaning. And he'd protest. He'd say, I want to clean. And he'd point to his bunk bed and said, go back to your books. So yes, you have to be busy with the world. You have to understand the world. You have to know how to communicate these messages. You have to be aware of what's out there that's so contrary to how you've been taught. At the end of the day, of course, you go back to your books. But I think if I had to give a message, Harabonim, is what I'm from following what's going on here, I think that would be the message, and I hope you'll be mochel me if it sounds critical. We need our Rabbanim desperately, and I certainly do as well. And so I say it with love and with tremendous respect.
Doesn't sound critical. It sounds as a reminder of the critical nature of the role Rabbanim should play. Yeshakayach, Dr. Feinberg, Yeshakayach to Ohel, to the Vaad Harabonim, Rabbi Marcus, Rabbi Schwartz, and of course to Nefesh and to Drs. Feinberg. May we meet next time discussing how to deal with the new Mashiach reality and how to change our way of thinking from living in America to living in Yerushalayim HaBenuya. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for your participation. It was very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Okay. Good night.